Richard LaPiere was born in 1899 in Beloit, Wisconsin. He enlisted in the Army during World War I and found himself doing mechanical repairs on the flying machines of the Lafayette Escadrille in France. Wounded, he was sent home and hospitalized at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Menlo Park, California. After the war, he ran a garage in California before entering Stanford to study engineering, but switched to economics for his bachelor's degree in 1926. He went on to graduate school, also at Stanford, but shifted to sociology for his 1927 MA and 1930 PhD degrees. Fortunately, he managed to get hired as a professor at Stanford in 1929, just before the stock market crashed, even though he was still completing his dissertation. He had a job right through the Great Depression and even managed to get married and publish this article in 1934, possibly the worst year of the 1930s. In fact, he never left Stanford, retiring in 1965 and remaining in Palo Alto as a professor emeritus until his death in 1986. This article, written nearly a century ago, gave social scientists an early warning that just asking people what they think or how they feel about things may not tell you how they actually will behave in a real situation. You can ask all the hypothetical survey questions you like, but if you want to see what people really do, you need to go out in real time to real places and observe the behavior for yourself, a lesson we sometimes still forget, even today. Richard LaPiere had just started teaching at Stanford when he got the idea for what is probably the most famous road trip ever taken by a sociologist. The results of this experience and how LaPiere followed it up are not only spelled out in his article we're reading from the journal Social Forces, but also celebrated by a special feature published in Stanford Magazine by former student Jonathan Fettervorm. The artwork from his feature helps us visualize the story. After helping two Chinese graduate students settle in as his next-door neighbors in Palo Alto, LaPiere enlisted them as companions in a 1930 tour all over the United States. They drove in his car from coast to coast, eating in restaurants, staying in hotels, and the new motor courts or motels invented at the dawn of the automobile age. But this was not just a vacation from the academic grind at Stanford. It was actually one of the earliest and best examples of what we might call first-person social research, or as it is sometimes known, direct participant observation. Sometimes LaPiere would go into an establishment along with his students, but sometimes he also waited in the car or busied himself with the luggage so that they had to go inside and seek service on their own. He wanted to see whether these establishments would refuse to serve Chinese people. It was not a crazy idea to expect that maybe his students would be turned away from hotels or restaurants. After all, this was 1930. There was no law against refusing to serve anyone, particularly racial and ethnic minorities, in any kind of public establishment. This was an era in American history when towns all across the country could enforce sundown laws that forced Black Americans to be out of town by nightfall or face physical violence. It was an era when movies, novels, and even children's stories routinely portrayed Asian, African, and other minority groups as not only different from whites of European origin in physical, mental, and even moral ways, but supported the general assumption that this difference amounted to inferiority, possibly even dangerous wickedness. LaPiere was well aware of these general public sentiments because his colleagues in social science were pioneering the early days of sample survey interviews featuring questionnaires that asked, among other things, about precisely these questions. As the results of these early surveys came in, his colleagues were dismayed by the overwhelmingly negative responses they got about minorities from their questionnaires. Awareness of this virulent prejudice in American society in the early 20th century made LaPiere nervous when he found himself responsible for making hotel reservations for two of his new graduate students arriving from China. As their faculty mentor, he was responsible for helping them to get settled and started on their graduate studies. So upon their arrival in Palo Alto, he took them to the best hotel in town. He was pleasantly surprised by the result. They had no trouble getting a room for his students. They also had no trouble arranging rental of the home next door to his. But after all, LaPiere reflected to himself, this could just be because people in that town were used to international visitors. The smooth experience also might have had something to do with their connection to Stanford University. Certainly an institution that no businessman in that area would ever dream of treating with anything but instant courtesy and respect. And of course, it might also have had something to do with his own presence, a white Stanford professor standing right beside them at the registration desk. LaPiere may not have thought much more about the experience just then, but a couple of months later he had to arrange another reservation for a Chinese visitor. This time, instead of showing up in the lobby with his guest, he called the hotel on the telephone. They promptly told him that no Chinese were allowed to stay in the hotel. This general attitude about Chinese people contrasted so sharply with the particular in-person experience of his students that LaPiere suddenly got a lot more interested. After all, if it was just a question of him as a white Stanford professor, hadn't he made the phone call as well as showing up in the lobby? This contrast sparked the idea for the 1930 road trip all around the country. With his two students, he took off in his car for several months, driving all the way across the country to the East Coast and back. Even when he waited in the car or busied himself unloading luggage, the young Chinese couple almost never encountered any resistance or discrimination. They ate in restaurants all over the country. They stayed in hotels, motor lodges, and campgrounds. Everywhere they went, they were treated as individuals, as paying customers, and only once were refused a room for the night out of hundreds of establishments they visited. By the time they got back to Palo Alto, LaPiere had to admit to himself that they had failed to uncover the nearly universal, virulent discrimination that he had expected they might encounter, based on the responses his colleagues had been collecting with their sample survey questionnaires. This unexpected result of the famous road trip really set LaPiere to thinking. How could there be such a disconnect between the survey results of his colleagues and the personal experiences of himself and his students? This disconnect is what led him to the next stage of his research project. Although LaPiere's tour of the country with his students turned up the interesting result that they encountered almost no direct, open discrimination along the way, the results of his next stage of research proved even more interesting. Throughout their trip, LaPiere made notes of the names and addresses of all the restaurants, campgrounds, hotels, and other businesses where they stopped. When they got back to Palo Alto, he wrote letters to every place they had visited. The letter didn't mention that they had visited the business themselves. It did ask a few short questions about the business, including whether Chinese people would be accepted as guests or customers. Just in case some recipients of the letters might remember their personal visit and make a connection, he also sent letters to other nearby businesses that he had observed on their trip, but where they had never actually visited. These other hotels and restaurants formed a control group for comparison with the places they had visited. The letters he sent out would not pass muster today as an acceptable research tool. He disguised his true purpose for sending them. Keeping his previous personal visit to each place a secret, the letter instead pretended to be from a national firm doing market research on the travel industry. LaPiere did not want his potential respondents to know that the research was mainly about prejudice towards Chinese and other race groups. He wanted them to think of the letter as just a general survey to improve efficiency in the industry and provide information to consumers and business owners. Today, he would have to submit the letter to the ethical scrutiny of his university's Human Subjects Review Board. They undoubtedly would tell him that he had to insert a disclaimer into the letter. He would have to explain what the study was for, and also would have to state clearly that the responses were purely voluntary and that no personal information about respondents or respondent businesses would be made public. But the 1930s were early days for this kind of research. In fact, this era amounted to the Wild West of scientific research in the United States. Not only did social researchers like LaPiere face no ethical guidelines or rules in designing their research, even medical researchers could try almost anything without regard for dangers to their patients or responsibility for any unfortunate results of the research. After all, this is the same era of scientific research when doctors in Tuskegee, Alabama, were deliberately infecting African American patients with sexually transmitted viruses like syphilis in order to study the progress of the disease. The only controls on scientific research came from ethical debates among the scientists themselves. As professionals, they believed that their special knowledge of their subject meant that nobody but themselves was competent to tell them how to conduct their research or to tell them that there were certain things they simply could not do. This professional arrogance seems almost unbelievable to us today. But LaPiere was working before all the ground rules of scientific research had been laid out. One good thing about this being the early days of social research was that such a letter was not just another item in a huge pile of junk mail arriving every day. A letter like his would have been quite unusual, and so fortunately for him and for us, a lot of people took the time to answer his questions. They put the filled out questionnaires back in the stamped self-addressed envelopes that he had sent along inside the letters and mailed them back to him at Stanford. When they opened all these responses, LaPiere and his students got their second surprise. From the same motels and restaurants where they in fact had been accepted as customers, the questionnaires virtually all said, no, Chinese people would not be accepted as guests. Of all the places they visited, only 2 sent back a clear, unreserved response that they would accept Chinese customers. Most places simply said, no Chinese allowed here. This astounded LaPiere's research team. Why would a place that actually had accepted them personally as customers send back a questionnaire saying that they would never do such a thing? They sifted through the responses, looking for any explanation they might find, but without success. The 2 clear yes answers out of around 200 responses came from one hotel where they had actually stayed, but also from one of the control group restaurants that they had never visited in person. A handful of questionnaires gave a maybe response, indicating that they might serve Chinese customers under some limited circumstances. But these were scattered uniformly between places to sleep and places to eat, and evenly divided between places they had visited and places they had never entered. LaPiere also introduced an additional control factor into the questionnaire design. Because respondents might feel differently about different minority groups, in most questionnaires he included several versions of the question aimed at different race groups, one of which was Chinese. In the rest of the questionnaires, he only asked about Chinese customers. Once again, we see no important difference for this distinction in the columns of Table 1 from his article. Whether Chinese are mentioned alone or as one of several possible race groups, nearly all the responses give a clear, direct, no answer to the question of accepting them as guests and customers. Incidentally, you might catch one error in Table 1 that seems to have slipped by the Social Forces editors. The next to the last column reports 51 total responses, but the numbers below add up to only 41 questionnaires. Probably this should have been a 41 in the top row of the column, making that figure about the same as those at the tops of the other columns for restaurant responses. Only 4 of these places admitted that they would even serve Chinese customers under special circumstances, and none of them gave an unreserved yes response. No obvious variations appear in these responses. No matter how or where he sent out his letters, LaPiere almost always got back a resounding no Chinese response from all the places they had visited, no different from the places they had not visited. How can we make sense out of these strange results? Over the years, people, including LaPiere and his students, have wrestled with his results. The most common interpretation sees his research illustrating the difference between prejudice, which exists in the form of attitudes or beliefs about abstract categories of people, and discrimination, which takes the form of concrete actions always a matter of face-to-face contacts between individuals. In fact, some research seems to show that such face-to-face contacts with individuals from different ethnic backgrounds may actually change stereotyped attitudes about other groups and reduce prejudice. Unless, of course, we're talking about face-to-face contacts that actually take the form of overt discrimination. Although LaPiere gave some thought to the distinction between prejudiced attitudes and discriminatory actions, he also suggested that there might be other problems with social research like his project. He forced us to recognize that all such research projects have to choose some particular method for measuring the research outcome to be studied. Direct first-person participant observation is one such strategy, the strategy he chose to start his project. Asking people to give answers to a questionnaire is in fact a completely different strategy for doing research. Each research method has its own strengths and weaknesses, and each method might in fact turn up different kinds of results. The questionnaire, on one hand, poses exactly the same questions to different respondents, but the form of the question has to be settled before you mail out the letters. What results would he have gotten if he had asked, "Have you ever served a Chinese customer?" instead of asking about a hypothetical future possibility? We'll never know. On the other hand, even when he didn't go into a restaurant or hotel along with his Chinese students, the proprietor might have looked out the window and seen this white-Stanford professor out by the car. His presence might have influenced their acceptance as customers. In fact, showing up in a car at all in 1930 would mark someone as relatively successful and prosperous, since cars were by no means cheap or universal at that time. What would have happened if the Chinese students had come walking along the road, or had stepped down from a bus instead? Again, we'll never know. Like all good research, LaPiere's study answered some questions, but raised new ones for us to puzzle over. Viewing the article nearly a century later, we also need to think about a few technical issues in that work, and that will occupy our final installment discussing the article. LaPiere's report that only 2 places they visited refused to serve his Chinese students appears as part of the evidence shown in Table 1 in his article. Adding up all the responses shown there, however, gives a total of only 128 returned questionnaires. This is not bad in terms of enough responses to show the overwhelming pattern of no Chinese allowed answers. But that total raises a question about what today we call non-response bias. After all, he sent out 251 letters, 67 to places where they slept along the way, and 184 to all the various places where they stopped to eat. Overall, the response rate of returned questionnaires was about 50%, but distributed unevenly, with 70% of the lodgings, but only 44% of the cafes and restaurants sending back replies. Such non-response can distort findings if the cases that don't respond differ in some key way from the cases that do send back the questionnaires. For example, places that don't respond could be more likely to have gone out of business during the Great Depression. It really does not seem too likely that the places failing to respond to LaPiere would have had dramatically different attitudes about minorities than the places that did reply. But today, researchers pay much more attention to this potential problem of non-response bias than he did in his article. The other methodological question that we ought to consider concerns reactivity to LaPiere himself. One thing we know for sure is that people often try to respond to others in ways they think those others want to hear. Although LaPiere reports that he made a point of sending the Chinese couple into a motel or cafe ahead of him to establish contact, in Table 2 of his article, he reports that in fact he was present for at least part of these interactions in nearly all cases. Out of 251 places they visited, in only 19 eating places and 12 of the places they stayed overnight did he not interact directly with the staff of the business in some way. We will never know what kind of reception his students would have received if they'd been traveling completely on their own, without a white Stanford professor usually somewhere in the picture. We will never know how much of the smooth reception they usually enjoyed might have been due in part to the staff of these places reacting to LaPiere's own presence. We can admit, though, that in the one case where they were refused service at a roadside campground, LaPiere himself made the first contact with the owner. His presence was not enough to prevent the refusal. A third issue about which LaPiere remains totally silent in this article concerns the historical context in which he conducted his road trip experiment and mailing of follow-up questionnaires. Their travels took place just as the United States was descending into the economic disaster of the Great Depression, with almost 1/4 of the total labor force eventually out of work, people finding themselves homeless, unemployed, desperate, frightened, and confused. And in the midst of this disaster, here comes LaPiere and his 2 Chinese guests cruising around the country in a private automobile with cash to pay for hotel rooms and restaurant meals. If you stop to think about this context for a moment, you might start to wonder whether these businesses would have been just as glad to see these guests a few years earlier, with a lot more other customers around to keep a business going. One of the reasons that LaPiere expected businesses to refuse service to Chinese was to avoid offending other white customers. Even if the manager wanted to take their money and provide a service, he might refuse that service with his other customers in mind. How many of the cafes where the research team stopped for lunch were full of such other customers when they arrived? How many times did they walk into an otherwise empty diner in those frightening economic times? Again, we'll never know how this historical context may have influenced LaPiere's results. In the end, though, LaPiere decided that being Chinese was only one social fact about his 2 students. As he put it, quote, "In the end, I was forced to conclude that those factors which most influenced the behavior of others toward the Chinese had nothing to do at all with race," unquote. These other factors mostly trace back to what we might call the social class of the people involved. He mentions the fact that even when they were tired and dusty, they all were usually well dressed. They had nice luggage, not cardboard suitcases or pillowcases full of their belongings. They were all well educated and spoke the English of educated people, even the Chinese couple, in an era when a large majority of Americans had never even finished high school. And of course, they were touring around in a private automobile. Nearly a century later, we are still debating the relative importance of these different aspects of personal identity, social class versus race or ethnicity, as determinants of life chances in American society. Which is more important? The pendulum of public and expert opinion swings back and forth, but we are still not sure about the answer. But LaPiere does not concern himself mainly with doubts and questions about his road trip, about their direct participant observations. He reserves most of his fire for what he sees as limitations with the use of sample survey questionnaires. A questionnaire may ask you to report your attitude or opinion about some social issue, including in LaPiere's case, the hypothetical arrival of a Chinese person in your place of business. But a person interacting with a questionnaire is involved in a special kind of social interaction simply by filling out the questionnaire. LaPiere insists that such answers are nothing but, quote, "a verbal response to a symbolic situation," unquote, and do not measure what actually would happen if the situation became real, concrete, face-to-face interaction. This is a warning or message that we still need to keep in mind today, 100 years later. Of course, LaPiere himself had some stereotypes that he presented as abstract, symbolic situations in the awkward passages at the end of his article. When talking about the strong endemic racism in American society, for example, he presents the stereotype of the Southern gentleman as somebody we can assume to be totally racist toward Black Americans. This stereotype downplays the fact that in the early 20th century, groups like the Ku Klux Klan were powerful political players in the legislatures of many northern states, that the notorious sundown laws and lynchings took place all across the country, both North and South, and that some of the most bigoted people I've ever met in my life were some of my own relatives who lived so far in the North that they were practically on the Canadian border and practically never interacted in person with anybody who wasn't white. Ironically, this display of his own stereotypes may actually strengthen LaPiere's argument that the questionnaire responses he got were possibly similar knee-jerk reactions to his questions based on stereotypes rather than concrete face-to-face social situations. Makes you wonder about all that survey research, doesn't it?